In this episode, today we're going to look at the conclusion of our story of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel and Samaria, the kingdom that had rebelled after the death of Solomon against his son Rehoboam, and they followed after a new king, set up a new king by the name of Jeroboam. Today, the story is told of that kingdom's ultimate fall. After hundreds of years of God constantly sending prophets to warn them, calling on them to turn back, today the end finally comes. The patience of God comes to its end, and the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria, finally falls to the Assyrians. That's what we're looking at today. We're also going to look at the 10 lost tribes of Israel, at least this idea of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. All of that is coming ahead. Thank you for listening, everyone. If you have not already signed up for our newsletter, go to jbshreve.com. Sign up so that every Monday you can receive an email, a devotional, so you can know what passages to read in 1st or 2nd Kings as we cover the entire course of this podcast series on the kings and prophets. So as we approach the end of the story of the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria, we seem to make a full circle. The kingdom that was birthed under the leadership of Jeroboam. He was the guy who rebelled against Rehoboam in Judah. Well, now it's being ruled, that northern kingdom is being ruled by Jeroboam II. Now, of course, the name given to this last king of the last great king of the northern kingdom is of no relation to the original Jeroboam. There have been numerous coups, numerous revolts since the days of that first one, the first Jeroboam, hundreds of years earlier there in Israel and the northern kingdom, Israel and Samaria. The capital city has been moved, and now the people of the north are often known to history as the Samaritans. The house of Jeroboam, in fact, the original house, it's come and gone. It's been overthrown. It's been wiped out, annihilated a couple of times over. You know, it was removed, and then the dynasty that replaced it, the house of Omri, it was removed. They were wiped out. So all of that has come and gone. There's been all this passage of time, all of these offers, all of these opportunities for redemption, for returning to God. But the worship of God has just come and gone in the northern kingdom by this time. We saw in the last episode that when provoked to war, the king of Israel and Samaria, he went so far as to pillage the temple of God in Jerusalem, right? When he invaded Jerusalem, he pillaged the temple of God. So few things are really sacred to the northern kingdom by this point in the story. We saw the famous revolt of Jehu and the establishment of his kingdom as he ruthlessly and brutally wiped out the house of Omri and Ahab earlier in the story. And it's there with the house of Jehu that I want to pick up our story today. But of course, it won't end here, right? Jeroboam II is the 4th king of Israel in the line of Jehu. All right. He's known to history as a fairly successful king. He ruled for 41 years. He was the longest reigning king of the northern kingdom, in fact. There were a few reasons that led to this enduring reign and stability for Jeroboam II. Most notably was the absence of any persistent threat of Syria and Aram, those kingdoms that had plagued the northern kingdom since the days of Elisha. So the kingdom of Aram, they're often known as Syria, Damascus, or Syria, in the accounts of the kings of the Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Kings. They've been a constant threat to the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria all this time, ever since Elisha. This is the land of Ben-Hadad and Hazael that we began hearing so much about during the days of Elijah and Elisha. Invasions from Syria from this land were frequent. There's a direct relationship between the success and failures, the rise and fall of national prosperity in the north and the influence of Syria, the influence of Aram, all right? But something began to change around the 8th century BC. The kingdom of Assyria, all right, be sure and recognize that difference. But they began to rise. The Assyrians, they were based out of the cradle of human civilization, Mesopotamia. On today's map, they would be, this would be the lands of like Iraq, mostly. Also a little bit of Turkey, Iran, parts of Syria, and Kuwait. But the Assyrians, they'd been around for centuries, but during this time period, they became an empire, the likes of which the world hadn't seen to this point. The Assyrians were the first, in fact, the first empire that was considered a global power. At one point, at their peak, the Assyrians' empire stretched all the way from Egypt to Iran, with its northern border in Turkey. They built highways across the Middle East that connected their empire's trading centers and allowed for quicker military movement. Supply centers and granaries were erected that fed those cities, but also fed the empire's armies as they went about conquering, for other kingdoms, other countries during that time period. So the plains of the Middle East, they had long been a site that attracted the kingdoms and the armies to battle there. All right. These are good battlefields, I guess you would say. So as that occurred throughout civilization's history in this region, the cities learned to protect themselves from these armies by erecting walls that protected the city. So as the armies would come and go on the plains, the cities would distinguish themselves. They would build walls to protect these armies who were coming and going. That was going on for centuries. An army might lay siege to a walled city, forcing it to the brink of starvation, and even beyond that, sometimes just completely annihilating them. We read about those kinds of accounts in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. We read about those all the way back in the days of David. David laid siege to different cities. In fact, to Jerusalem, he laid siege to it. But if the walled city, the people within that city, if they couldn't hold out, then they could, if they could hold out anyway, they could outlast the besieging army. That was the idea. That was the city's defenses. The army that was besieging the city, it would run out of food and they'd be forced to finally retreat to their homeland to restock. Well, by that time, the army and its rulers were often at odds with one another. And so a failed siege by an invading force, it could usually translate into a coup or a revolt by that army against that ruler. All right, we see this happen over and over again in ancient history. But the Assyrians, they changed the tactic with new technology here. All right, they changed the technology with highways and supply centers that empowered those armies. So on the plains, they would amass these hordes of horse-drawn chariots, but on the cities, they unleashed unprecedented siege warfare. Battering rams were the most effective weapon, where under the cover of archers, these tools were used like tanks to topple city walls, topple city gates, right? Siege towers were erected so that the archers could shoot from a greater height and take out a city's defenders on its own walls. There are accounts of the Assyrians in some cities where the walls were protected on one side by rivers, and the Assyrians would build this floating siege tower to strike the city. They'd float a siege tower down the river, arrive at that city's walls, and they would go in from that angle. Ladders were created as this powerful new tool by the Assyrians. It's kind of funny to think there wasn't really a sophisticated type of ladder before this time period. Again, under the cover of archers with bows and arrows, the Assyrians would climb the walls on these ladders, climb the walls of the city, even while other soldiers dug mines and under the walls to go in from underneath. So the Assyrians, with their strengthened supply lines, they would set up these granaries along the pathways, conquer a city, take away all its food, put it in their granaries. Well, they could keep at this siege warfare for longer than any military power before them. The Assyrians were known as the first truly military empire. All right, this is the Iron Age. That gives an understanding to a verse from a prophet like Joel. He wrote about a terrible invading force. He said, they leap upon the city, they run up on the walls, they climb up into the houses, they entered through the windows like a thief. Those words right there, that's actually I remember those words from a song. When I was in church growing up, we would hear a song. They leap on the city, they run on the walls, something like that. Great is the army that carries out the will of the Lord. That was the way the song went. I don't remember the exact words. That prophecy, those words are actually about someone like the Assyrians or the Babylonians, a kingdom like this. Not about the army of God that we would normally think of. It was about the bad guys. That's what the prophet Joel is warning about there. Sometimes the Assyrians, they would employ psychological warfare when they were conducting these sieges. So as the city stood, captives would be found and they would be butchered outside the city walls. The tortured cries of pain and death driving the inhabitants of the city, the residents of the city, those on the other side of the wall in safety, it would drive them insane, mad with fear and anxiety over what awaited, because they're hearing the cries of their friends and their loved ones on the other side of the city walls as they're being tortured to death. When the Assyrians took a city, it wasn't any calm affair, all right? This was not a minor event. Once a city fell to the Assyrians, widespread looting, widespread pillage, it commenced. Everything was desecrated. Human life became utterly expendable. It was akin to what the Vikings would do more than 1,000 years later as they ravaged the coastal cities of Europe. The Assyrians, they were a terror to their enemies. They were also among the first world powers to use human capital in a new way. Sometimes, having conquered cities, they would move some of their own people into the region to colonize, to control the area. On other occasions, when they conquered a city, if that city rebelled, if they resisted, rather than merely wiping out the population within those walls, after they took the walls down and took over the city, well, they would disperse the population, the residents of that city, the conquered city. They would disperse the population as slaves to the faraway borders of the Assyrian Empire, eradicating the memory of that nation and people group from the city they had once inhabited. This was the terrible army that was arising at this point in the story of the kings and prophets. Far to the north, they arose, and during the times of Jeroboam II, they served really as a benefit at first to the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria, because at this point, it really wasn't Israel and Samaria that the Assyrians were a threat to. Not yet, anyway. It was the kingdom of Syria, or Aram, that was threatened, right? These old, long-time enemies, these long-time threats to Israel and Samaria were now the ones having to face the Assyrians. In a very real way, the enemy of my enemy was a friend in the eyes of Jeroboam II. And thus came an era defined by prosperity and stability during Jeroboam II's long reign. In Israel and Samaria, Assyria and Aram warred and faced the terror of Assyria on its northern and eastern borders. Israel-Samaria was taking land back that had been captured previously by Syria and Aram. So in the days of Jeroboam II, it was seen as kind of a little bit of a golden age. Jeroboam II was not a great king of Israel-Samaria, even though his reign is remembered for its stability, for its prosperity, but he also wasn't the worst. The Bible records that he didn't depart from the idolatrous ways of his predecessor, and yet there was some level of the knowledge and honor of the one true God as well during his reign in the northern kingdom. We see this in the name he gives to his son, Zechariah, who would succeed him. Zechariah's name means Yahweh is remembered. So, that was something, at least. That was something to his credit. The prophets of God were also very active during this time. The prophet Jonah, son of Amittai, who we will mention again later, he gave counsel to Jeroboam II in his expansion and recapture of lands from the kingdom of Aram and Syria. It seems that the worship of God was kind of occurring alongside the worship of false gods during this time period throughout the northern kingdom, which relatively speaking, was a revival of sorts in this part of the world. Jeroboam II was making Israel and Samaria great again. The worship of God was restored, even while the worship of false gods was also tolerated, accommodated. Everyone could do what they wanted, it seemed, and based on the political and economic effect, God was blessing that. At least that's the way the people saw it. But that, of course, is a pretty horrible way to perceive reality. Understanding the will of God based on information given from the earth around you is not really a good or healthy way to see the world. Israel was experiencing one of its most prosperous periods in a long time, but God wasn't happy with them. They were feeling strength and stability, but God wasn't pleased with them. And we know all of this because large swaths of the Old Testament, some of the most famous parts of the prophets, in fact, are from those times under Jeroboam II. Jonah, the son of Amittai, was advising the king of Israel and Samaria, but there were other prophets in the land warning that judgment's coming. The prophet Hosea, he broadcast his message of judgment to Israel and Samaria over the course of about 60 years. We don't know a lot about his personal life, about this guy, as far as his occupation and things like that. But the one thing that was most notorious, this notorious act of prophetic imagery and representation, it's carried out right here by this prophet when he goes and he marries a prostitute. Hosea does. He marries a prostitute by the name of Gomer. And he explains this is what it's been like for God to be covenanted with Israel and Samaria. Although he was faithful, God was faithful, his bride was unfaithful. And she wouldn't stop being unfaithful. Hosea is known as a doomsday prophet because he's constantly warning of the judgment that's coming to Israel and Samaria. One of my favorites of the books of the prophets is Amos. Amos was a shepherd, a fig tree farmer. He famously explains within the prophetic book of his own name, it's titled the Book of Amos, that he was not among the sons of the prophets, meaning he wasn't trained as a prophet. He was trained as a farmer. Nevertheless, the word of the Lord comes to this guy. He lived in Judah at the time, the southern kingdom. Yet it's a word given to him for Israel and Samaria, the northern kingdom. Amos was a contemporary to the famous prophet Isaiah. It's believed that Amos's prophetic ministry began a few years even before Isaiah. But whereas Isaiah focuses on the southern kingdom, and we're going to look at Isaiah here in a future episode, but Amos focused on the northern kingdom. And the message of Amos was pretty clear. God was not pleased. Amos describes the society of Israel and Samaria as full of wealthy, complacent, secure people. Yet beneath the surface, there are striking issues of inequity that are opposite of what the design of the law of God wanted for his people. The rich exploit the poor. They live in lavish homes and enjoy lives of decadence, even while the poor suffer. This is a passage from Amos 6. I'm going to start with verse 4. It says, "How terrible for you who sprawl on ivory beds and lounge on your couches, eating the meat of tender lambs from the flock and of choice calves fattened in the stall. You sing trivial songs to the sound of the harp and fancy yourselves to be great musicians like David. You drink wine by the bowlful and perfume yourselves with fragrant lotions. You care nothing about the ruin of your nation. Therefore, you will be the first to be led away as captives. Suddenly, all your parties will end." That's Amos 6, verses 4 to 7. Riches in and of themselves, they're not bad. But it's the exploitation of the poor, along with these riches, that are so terrible in the eyes of the prophet Amos, and more importantly, in the eyes of God. Here's another one. This is from Amos chapter 4, verses, just going to read the first 6 verses here. It says, "Listen to me, you fat cows living in Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and who are always calling to your husbands, bring us another drink. The sovereign Lord has sworn this by his holiness. The time will come when you will be led away with hooks in your noses. Every last one of you will be dragged away like a fish on a hook. You will be led out through the ruins of the wall. You will be thrown down from your fortress, says the Lord. Go ahead, offer sacrifices to the idols at Bethel. Keep on disobeying at Gilgal, offering sacrifices each morning, and bring your tithes every 3 days. Present your bread made with yeast as an offering of thanksgiving. Then give your extra voluntary offerings so you can brag about it everywhere. This is the kind of things you Israelites love to do, says the sovereign Lord. I brought hunger to every city and famine to every town, but still you would not return to me, says the Lord." That's verses 1 to 6 of Amos chapter 4. The prophetic book of Amos, it's striking to me because it lines up so clearly with our own day and age and culture. In the U.S. and other countries of the West today, inequality and injustice has become so rampant, we take it for granted. We don't even realize how bad it's gotten. And yet the design of God is that the earth can't endure this. God said the earth would spit out the people of God when they allow such injustice and inequality to dominate the society. This is what Amos is warning about right here. This can't stand. It will not last. And just like in the days of Amos, we can't suppose that our religious devotion today will save us. All our rituals and traditions are nothing if they don't take an effect on changing the real lifestyle of our society. As John said in the New Testament, you can't say you love God but hate your brother. That makes you a liar. You can't cover up unjust treatment of others with the religious rituals that pretend to turn toward God. It doesn't work. Here's another passage from Amos chapter 5, verse 21 to 24. It says, "I hate all your show and pretense, the hypocrisy of your religious festivals and solemn assemblies. I will not accept your burnt offerings and grain offerings. I won't even notice all your choice peace offerings. Away with your noisy hymns of praise. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Instead, I want to see a mighty flood of justice, an endless river of righteous living." Powerful words right there. The book of Amos has been a treasure chest among believers who have seen God's priority upon social justice among the nations and within the worldview of God's people. The prophets Isaiah, Micah. They echo a lot of the same themes, but they were focused on the southern kingdom of Judah. We'll look at them in a later episode. For now, I think it's interesting that this surge in prophetic activity preceding the coming judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel-Samaria, that this surge is happening. Amos says at one point in his book, God does nothing without revealing his plans to the prophets. We've seen this before, but the nature of prophetic activation that takes place during the reign of Jeroboam II, and beyond that, in fact, it's a signal for us of how big the coming event is. God isn't whispering warnings to Israel and Samaria. He's roaring. The time's up. Danger is at your door. Judgment is at hand. I think we can learn a lot from this for our own times. The point is that the major movement of God is preceded by prophetic activation. That doesn't mean it's always judgment, but when God is about to do something major, the level of prophetic activity, it's escalating big time. We see this in Scripture. We see it today, I think. That's what happened here. Different from Elijah and Elisha, we see the prophets who are writing books here, recording their messages from God, capturing the words and principles for their generation. And during the era of Jeroboam II, but also for later generations who would find God activating the same principles and ethics in later days, including our own, we see a surge, a renewal, a heightened level of prophetic activity taking place as God is roaring, something's coming, something's coming. The reign of Jeroboam II included the most prosperous years that the northern kingdom had known since they separated from Judah under the revolt of Jeroboam I. But it was all cosmetic. Inwardly, the kingdom was rotting away. And as King Jeroboam II, as he died, we see that rot began to take over almost immediately. His son Zechariah is coronated as king of Israel. And following the now well-established pattern of the northern kingdom, that new king is assassinated. We've seen this over and over again in the story, right? 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 8 to 10, it says, Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. So that's what's going on in the south. Zechariah, he reigned in Samaria for 6 months. Zechariah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, as his ancestors had done. He refused to turn from sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. Then Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah, assassinated him in public, and became the next king. So at the height of Israel and Samaria's prosperity, this public assassination of the king, it triggers enormous instability, really at the worst time possible. New power vacuums, counter coups, and revolts are launched from one king to the next, and all of this is happening as Assyria is finally consolidating its power in the east and beginning to turn its gaze toward the west, where Israel and Samaria are located. So the leader of the conspiracy to assassinate Zechariah, Shallum, son of Jabesh, he lasts about a month in power. I'm just going to read straight from 2 Kings here. It says, Shallum, son of Jabesh, began to rule over Israel in the 39th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. Shallum reigned in Samaria only 1 month. Then Menahem, son of Gadai, went to Samaria from Tirzah and assassinated him, and he became the next king. Menahem is a warlord, a brutal dictator that cracks down on Israel and Samaria with his intent to rule the kingdom. Few things are really known about this guy. That we don't talk about him a lot in the Bible, but during his short 10 years in power, what is mentioned is the highlight of his brutality. 2 Kings 15, verse 16, it says, At the time, Menahem destroyed the town of Tappuah and all the surrounding countryside as far as Tirzah, because its citizens refused to surrender the town. He killed the entire population and ripped open the pregnant women, right there in Scripture. That's pretty brutal. That's a pretty terrible legacy to leave in the earth by nothing less than the Word of God itself right there. And yet, none of this was even the worst of it. As Israel and Samaria appears to be losing its mind amid the coups and the counter coups that followed the reign of Jeroboam II, in 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III, he took the control of Assyria. He came to the Assyrian throne. More than any other Assyrian ruler before him, Tiglath-Pileser is the king who would trigger the rise of Assyria into the first global military world power. right? He's consolidated all of his power, and now we have our first global military world power in the history of human civilization. His rule made the Assyrians into the most powerful kingdom the Middle East had ever known. Within the space of half a century, the ancient Middle East was captured under the rule of Assyria. Pelezer conquered Babylon, then the kingdom of Aram, and by the time his successor came to power, Shalmaneser, that's Tiglath-Pileser's successor, Shalmaneser, by the time he's in power, Assyria was already ruling in the land of Israel and Samaria. Menahem, the new king of the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria, tries to buy time to hold back the Assyrian front. But he taxes the aristocracy of the northern kingdom. He raises a huge financial treasure, which he uses as a payment to Pul of Assyria. That's another king. In the Bible, Pul is the nickname of actually Tiglath-Pileser III. Okay, so that's when you see that in 2 Kings, it's the same guy, just a nickname. Menahem did what he could to cooperate with the Assyrians. His son, Pekahiah, did the same thing. If they could just hold out, these rulers of the northern kingdom thought certainly a force from some other part of the world might pull the Assyrians away from Israel and Samaria's borders. They couldn't hold out long enough, though. Already, the kingdom of Israel and Samaria was beginning to disintegrate under the pressures, both internally and externally. Both this instability from all of the coups and counter-coups and the overtaxation domestically, but also the threat of Assyria that's coming to their borders. A new leader by the name of Pekah. He's a general from within King Pekahiah's army. He revolted. He began accumulating power and loyalty among the different tribes within the nation of Israel and Samaria. And so emboldened, he finally overthrew his king, Pekahiah. And now Pekahiah became the new leader of Israel and Samaria. He wouldn't enjoy it very long. He would be the last ruler, all right? Whereas King Pekahiah, I get these names, they get a little bit confusing here, but whereas the king Pekahiah and his father Menahem tried to cooperate, accommodate, and appease the Assyrians, the new king Pekah, after assassinating Pekahiah, he made a new policy of resisting the Assyrians. You can read between the lines here. The aristocracy of the northern kingdom, they longed for the days of prosperity that they had experienced, that they remembered under Jeroboam II. They were tired of the tax dollars going to the Assyrians. It was time to take a stand. And Pekah said he would do it, and he would set his court in place to resist the Assyrians, but he would also seal his own fate. Israel-Samaria's new king, Pekah, he began forming alliances throughout the region to wage war against the Assyrians. He linked up with Aram, what was left of Aram. He linked up with other nations like Edom and Philistia, and all of these were fighting against the Assyrians in the same region of the world. And King Pekah reached out even to Judah, the southern kingdom. He said, join us in the fight against the Assyrians. And Jotham, the king there in Judah, he refused. And we're going to look at that from the perspective of Judah in a greater detail in a later episode. But this refusal from their cousins, from their brothers, their traditional brothers in the southern kingdom of Judah, it infuriated King Pekah. And for a moment, he even takes his eyes off the Assyrians and he invades the southern kingdom of Judah, unleashing a wave of brutality and massacres, even laying siege once again to Jerusalem itself. Judah doesn't fall, all right, but they are certainly shaken by this invasion of Pekah from the north, and it leaves a mark on their national psyche that won't soon be forgotten. While all of this disarray and warfare is taking shape throughout the western portion of the Middle East, the Assyrian war machine continues to roll on. One territory after another of the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria falls before the Assyrian onslaught. They keep gradually, incrementally coming into Israel and Samaria, coming in from the north, coming in from the east, and taking one territory, one city after another. King Pekah's effort at resistance, they're completely ineffective. They probably even made things worse, to be honest with you. The kingdom of Philistia is destroyed. The ancient Philistines, they're gone. Within the northern kingdom, the region of Galilee is conquered, a major portion of its territory. This is 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. It says, during Pekah's reign, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria attacked Israel again, and he captured the town of Ijon, Abel-Beth-Mekah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor. He also conquered the region of Gilead, Galilee, and all of Naphtali, and he took the people to Assyria as captives. Israel-Samaria was being vaporized from the pages of history. And within that story is the account of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of human lives. As we've already seen, the Assyrian advance relied on this tactic of dispossessing populations. The people of these lands in the northern kingdom, they weren't just killed, not all of them, but many of them were transplanted. They were enslaved by the Assyrian armies. Families were torn apart. Women and children were shipped to different corners of the empire. Fathers and husbands and boys to other parts of the empire. The Assyrians certainly killed their fair share of captives, but rather than just wiping out populations, they relied on this human capital to continually fuel the Assyrian war machine, the Assyrian Empire. This wasn't just the Jewish people. They did this all over the Middle East. The Assyrians did. They disconnected the people from their homelands, eradicating their influence and potential for rebellion. And then they would transplant them in other cities as slaves so they could empower the Assyrian economy and the Assyrian power. In this way, Assyria, unlike the kingdoms that came before, they disappeared cultures, even cultures as great and famous as that of Israel and Samaria, full of so much heritage and pride as those who had once been known as the people of God. So as Assyria advanced, and as King Pekah proved himself incapable of stopping that advance, he eventually met the fate of so many kings of Israel and Samaria, the fate he had even employed against his predecessors. And you can guess what happens to him. He gets assassinated, right? Pekah's futility endured for 20 years, and as he sat on the throne of a nation destined for collapse, Hosea, his assassin and successor, he would rule for 10 years, and at last, this would be the final king of Israel and Samaria. So I'm hoping if you're enjoying this podcast series on the kings and prophets, you've taken the time to head over to jbshreve.com. We've got loads of other podcast Bible study series available to you right now at that website, jbshreve.com. In fact, a few months ago, we did an in-depth walkthrough on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, verse-by-verse study on this remarkable teaching of Jesus that was meant to be the foundation of life in the kingdom of God. I really encourage you, go check that one out. It was the first one we did, actually, with both video and audio available. So you can watch it on YouTube, download it at Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcast. There's a series on gratitude at jbshreve.com, study on the book of John. There's just a bunch of stuff there at the website, and more is always coming. So head over, check it out. Be sure to sign up for the newsletter while you're there, jbshreve.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Somewhere along the timeline, between Jeroboam II to Hosea, we don't know for sure when, but we find the great story of the prophet Jonah. Now, I mentioned Jonah was an advisor already to Jeroboam II. This prophet witnessed the decline and fall of Israel and Samaria from those great heights into the chaos that now dominated the landscape of that region. And alongside that, we saw the rise of the fortunes of Assyria. In 668 BC, the Assyrian city of Nineveh, it became the largest city in the world. In the book of Jonah, it's called the great city of Nineveh. It was renowned at this point in history, and yet intricately linked to Assyrian brutality, dominance, and power in the eyes of the people of Israel and Samaria. And so it's from that vantage point that we might better understand why the whole story of Jonah picks up with him fleeing, not from the Assyrians, but from the prophetic call of God to go to Nineveh and encourage them to repent. Jonah doesn't want Nineveh to repent. He wants the city to fall. He wants Assyria to be destroyed. He wants Israel to be great again. And that sense of denial explains what's going on with Jonah. But why does he run from Israel? I mean, have you ever really thought about that? Why does he run from Israel? How does that make any sense to run from the call of God? Well, the book of Jonah explicitly states that he was seeking to run from the presence of God itself. And up to this point, the people of God understood that the name of God, his presence, it was directly connected to the land. How could the name of God endure? The presence of God, how could it endure if the people were dispossessed from the land he had given them? And many of the prophets going forward in this story, they'll come to understand a new perspective of God and his intentions in the earth. As the prophet Habakkuk will explain later in the story, God is saying, I'm doing a new thing, something you wouldn't believe even if you were told. Amid the destruction and the chaos of Israel and Samaria's collapse and Judah's collapse that will eventually follow, God was still on his throne. He was still active and engaged in the earth, but his plans were bigger than the kings and prophets of Israel, bigger than even those prophets realized. His plans are often bigger than we realize today, in fact. As King Hosea of Israel and Samaria took to the throne, he probably couldn't have realized he would be the last king of Samaria, the last king to rule over this people of the northern lands, the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria. He couldn't have realized, in fact, that the people of these lands that he ruled over, they would actually disappear from history. But that's where the story of Israel and Samaria is going to end. So dominant was Assyria now in this region that Tiglath-Pileser III, he even approves of Hosea's coronation as king. He signs off on it, all right? In other words, Hosea is appointed by the Assyrians themselves. That they're now the overlord of Israel and Samaria. Hosea can rule Israel and Samaria. He can keep the nation in line as long as that line remains true to Assyrian interests. Now, this was probably a saving grace for Israel and Samaria. Their longtime enemy in Damascus, the kingdom of Aram, they had been defeated by the Assyrians, and their king had been executed. Their capital city destroyed. A pro-Assyrian king on the throne in Samaria was a good thing for Israel and Samaria. So Hosea begins his reign by stopping the bleeding. Like Mehunnam and Pekahiah before him, Hosea, he raises this big tribute and pays off Assyria. He signals his loyalty, his desire for peace with the great empire. King Hosea's kingdom has already been greatly reduced by the Assyrians. All that really remains of the northern kingdom by this point, in fact, is the hill country, the cities of the north. The rest has been wiped out by the Assyrians already. Having paid off the Assyrians, held back the tide of war for now, Hosea opens up the border with Judah. He allows the people of the north to travel to the south. If they want to cry to God, go to Jerusalem. Go for it. Do whatever you can. Cry out to God and try to save this nation. The sacred cities of the north, the cities where Jeroboam had placed his golden calves all those years before, they've been conquered. They've been destroyed by Assyria already. There's no use holding on to what that past by this point in the story. After 4 years on the throne, things shift dramatically for King Hosea. Most notably, the king of Assyria dies. Tiglath-Pileser III, he goes the way of all men, and into his seat arises a new king of Assyria, Shalmaneser. For some reason, Shalmaneser is seen as really as a weak ruler when he initially takes the throne. Now, it wasn't true, of course, but that's the perspective in the region, and it sets off a nasty chain of events. If Shalmaneser is weak, then now's the time for revolt. And so it's right there, that's what caused it, right there that revolution conspiracies begin to form, begin to be plotted against Assyria. That begins to spread throughout this region. With Egypt, also recently conquered by Assyria, they're serving as the headquarters of those conspiracies. And although Hosea doesn't officially join any Egyptian-sponsored revolution or conspiracy, it is learned that he sent messengers to Egypt to hear and at least consider those plans. Just as bad, Hosea misses a payment of annual tribute that he was scheduled to make to Assyria. Well, that's further signs of potential rebellion in the eyes of the new emperor. So for the Assyrians, who rule with an iron fist, that's enough right there. It's not going to stand. Shalmaneser of Assyria moves his armies back into the region to confront the issue head on and prove once and for all he's no weak king. In an effort to fend off calamity, Hosea heads out to meet with Shalmaneser and his army before they arrive to Samaria. Most likely, Hosea and his entourage, they traveled with treasure. They missed the missed tribute payment that they had not paid for some reason. They brought it in person in an effort to mend their relationship with the Assyrian overlords. Well, that effort fails. King Hosea, the last king of Israel, he's arrested upon making contact with the Assyrian army. He's in prison. He's even taken back to Assyria. He disappears from history at this point. We don't know if he was executed, if he was tortured, if he was used as an entertainment spectacle, an attraction at Assyrian parties. The last king of Israel and Samaria, he just disappears from history. Meanwhile, the Assyrians do what everyone had feared they might do. They lay siege to Samaria, the capital city, and almost all that remains of Israel and Samaria right there is under threat and under attack by the Assyrians. Those Israelites of the northern kingdom that had not previously fled or previously been taken captive by the Assyrians, they're holed up within these walls of the Samaritan city. They have no king. Administrators within the city try to hold it together. For 3 years, this siege continues. Now, the record's a little fuzzy here, but apparently Shalmaneser died during this time period, and Sargon II becomes the new king of Assyria. And it's he, Sargon II, who's credited with the final blow to Israel and Samaria. As the walls of the capital city are finally breached after 3 years of siege, the Assyrians overrun the city and unleash unimaginable horrors, terrors, and devastation. Tens of thousands are killed. At least 27,000 Israelites who had been hiding behind the walls of Samaria, they're taken captive and they're shipped to colonies in far-off corners of the Assyrian Empire. The northern kingdom of Israel, it doesn't recover from this blow. They disappear, in fact, from history. In fact, in later centuries, much later centuries, this legend begins to develop about the lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Through the centuries, different explorers, they came to believe that they had found evidence of the lost tribes of Israel. These tribes that were carried away from Israel by the Assyrians so long ago. So when you study the age of the explorers, you'll find this idea mentioned when explorers moved to the continent of Africa, as far away as Afghanistan. People thought that they had found, these different European explorers, they thought that they had found the lost tribes of Israel, the tribes that had been displanted, exported, moved to the far-off corners of the Assyrian Empire. Throughout the centuries, everyone from the Mormons to the American Indians to the Japanese were they either said to be or they claimed to be the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. The truth is, the lost tribes weren't lost. They were destroyed. What little remained after the Assyrian destruction was enslaved into far-off Assyrian settlements and colonies. The few who survived that eventually integrated into Assyrian culture, into Assyrian society. The tribes of the north, they disappeared, eviscerated from the pages of history. The Assyrians went further. They shipped other slaves and captives into the lands of the north in an effort to wipe out the memory of Israel in those territories. Remember, we've talked about how this was kind of a common tactic for the Assyrians. 2 Kings explains what all happened here. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but if you wanted to read 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 26 to 39, it explains how the Assyrians did this. I'm just going to read a couple of verses. It said, these new residents worshiped the Lord. So new people who were moved from the other parts of the Assyrian Empire, they were then placed in the northern area, the place of Israel and Samaria. These new residents worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests to offer sacrifices at their place of worship. And though they worshiped the Lord, they continued to follow their own gods according to the religious customs of the nations from which they came. And this is still going on today. This is according to what's being recorded here in 2 Kings. They continue to follow their former practices instead of truly worshiping the Lord and obeying the decrees, regulations, instructions, and commands he gave to the descendants of Jacob, whose name he changed to Israel. So in the earlier verses there, the verse in that passage, the longer passage that I didn't go into, what happened is that a lot of the people that were transplanted, that were moved into Israel and Samaria, those lands formerly known as Israel and Samaria, that the people, the Assyrians, moved there, this weird thing started happening where the people started being attacked by bears and lions, started being devoured by them. And this is significant. The Assyrians, they initiate their regular practice of population transfer upon the lands of Israel and Samaria, but it's not working like it normally did. Now, we've seen in other passages, even within this series of the Kings and Prophets, being devoured by lions and bears is usually seen as a judgment from God. Well, the Assyrians assumed as much for sure, all right? They saw it as a judgment from God. So to counter this, they sent back some of the Israelites that they had already moved, all right? They knew, hey, some of these Israelites, they worship God. We need to put them back in their homeland, at least a few of them, since they know how to worship their God there. So these were some of the priests that had been enslaved and shipped elsewhere within the empire. The Israelite priests, they came back to Israel and they helped to settle the situation. But the worship to false gods didn't stop. In fact, this weird new hybrid of religion, it developed over time. Partly they would worship Yahweh. Partly they would worship other gods, including the gods of their Assyrians and their later Babylonian overlords. So this wasn't a story of restoration, this idea of bringing these people back. It wasn't a story of restoration in the lands that once made up the northern kingdom. It's an origin story. The people who had this hybrid religion that developed here, they would eventually become known as the Samaritans. It's their descendants that we encounter when we get to the New Testament. And you can sense within the pages of the Gospels how Jewish society there in Jerusalem really kind of repulsed against their presence, these Samaritans, the presence of these Samaritans and their beliefs. They were outsiders. They were people who lived near the people of God. Because they were Israel, the northern kingdom was no longer the people of God. They were just near the people of God. All that remained now, with the eradication of Israel and Samaria, now all that remained at this point in our story was Judah, the southern kingdom, the last of the tribes of Judah. Now, I find this whole account really fascinating. The rise and fall of the northern kingdom, it's one of the important aspects of the whole story of the kings and prophets, and it's important to understand why and how it happened. As the northern kingdom fades into the pages of history and disappears from our story as we go forward, I think it's important to close, I'm going to close this episode, in fact, with these final words about the northern kingdom. This is how it's described in the book of 2 Kings. We believe it was Jeremiah who wrote these words, the prophet Jeremiah. The book of 2 Kings closes with these words. We've looked at how the northern kingdom fell, and this is what's understood as to why. 2 Kings, and I'm going to look at chapter 17. I'm going to read verses 7 to 23 here as we close out this episode. This disaster came upon the people of Israel because they worshipped other gods. They sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them safely out of Egypt and had rescued them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had followed the practices of the pagan nations of the Lord that the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them, as well as the practices the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel had also secretly done many things that were not pleasing to the Lord their God. They built pagan shrines for themselves in all their towns, from the smallest outpost to the largest walled city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles at the top of every hill and under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on all the hilltops, just like the nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them. So the people of Israel had done many evil things, arousing the Lord's anger. Yes, they worshipped idols, despite the Lord's specific and repeated warning. Again and again, the Lord had sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah, turn from all your evil ways, obey my commands and decrees, the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I gave you through my servants, the prophets. But as the Israelites would not listen, they were as stubborn as their ancestors who had refused to believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and they despised all his warnings. They worshipped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. They followed the examples of the nations around them, disobeying the Lord's command not to imitate them. They rejected all the commands of the Lord, their God, and made 2 calves from metal. They set up an Asherah pole and worshiped Baal and all the forces of heaven. They even sacrificed their own sons and daughters in the fire. They consulted fortune tellers and practiced sorcery and sold themselves to evil, arousing the Lord's anger. Because the Lord was very angry with Israel, he swept them away from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained in the land. But even the people of Judah refused to obey the commands of the Lord their God, for they followed the evil practices that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them by handing them over to their attackers until he had banished Israel from his presence. For when the Lord tore Israel away from the kingdom of David, they chose Jeroboam, son of Nebat, as their king. But Jeroboam drew Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. And the people of Israel persisted in all the evil ways of Jeroboam. They did not turn from these sins until the Lord finally swept away from his presence, just as all his prophets had warned. So Israel was exiled from their land to Assyria, where they remain to this day.